Welcome to August, more appropriately known by bookworms with excellent taste as Women in Translation Month, or WIT Month. WIT Month is a wonderful time, one of my favourite times of the year, where we celebrate women in translation. In case you don't know how this works and you've never done this before, gather up a little stack of books that were translated into English by men, women, and anyone in between from any other languages in the world, and the only rule is that the book had to have originally been written by a woman, women in translation. The gender of the translator doesn't matter. The publication date doesn't matter. Just spend this month reading books in translation that were originally written by women. Every year, Whit Month comes around and I give some recommendations. This time I'm focusing on books that were just published this year. Not the original publication, but the English translation. Every book I'm going to talk about here, and I have 10 to talk about, have all been published in 2023 in their English translation. This is to showcase just how many wonderful books in translation written by women exist in the world for us to read and celebrate and marvel at. Let's go. First up is a book that I only just got through reading, a book that has only just come out, published by Scribe. This is What I'd Rather Not Think About. It is a Dutch novel written by Jente Postuma. I have absolutely no idea if that's how that name is pronounced. Dutch readers are currently laughing at me, and that's fine. This was translated from Dutch into English by Sarah Timmer Harvey. It's set in the modern day. It is a piece of intense literary fiction. It is very, very dark, and the entire novel is presented as a series of very, very small vignettes. Every vignette, or chapter, if you like, is 1 to 2 pages long, often less than a page long, which makes this a 200-page novel that can easily be read in an afternoon. And it tells the story of a pair of twins. Our narrator protagonist is the girl of the pair. She and her twin brother have always been inseparable. They grew up in a small rural town in the Netherlands, and when they turned 18, they both moved to Amsterdam and got apartments close to each other. They spent their childhoods playing games and copying things they saw on film and TV. Their father left the family and moved to Brazil, but as the blurb tells us, the brother is eventually going to take his own life. He does so when he and his sister are 35 years old, and they've seen a lot together. They've lived their entire lives together. They've grown apart at times and come back together at times. They've fought, argued, disagreed, but have always remained close. And eventually, the brother kills himself. And this story is told from the sister's perspective. She has a therapist and she often talks to the therapist, and we kind of sit and listen like a fly on the wall. And as the tagline says, what do you do when you're a twin? Your twin doesn't want to be alive anymore, but you don't know how to live without them. That's the whole point of this novel. Most of it recounts their lives together, and occasionally, because this is told kind of out of order, she remarks on what she's supposed to be now, what she's supposed to do now, what her life can mean anymore without her brother there. It's a dark book, it's tough to read, but it is wonderfully rewarding. Next, published in English this year by Charco Press, is Of Cattle and Men by Brazilian author Ana Paula Maia. This was translated into English from the Portuguese by Zoe Perry. It's a tiny little novel, and it is very, very dark. As the title implies, it's kind of a twist on Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, a book that I taught several times back when I was an English teacher. Like Of Mice and Men, this is a book about capitalism, about class struggles, about inequality, about the injustice that workers face on a daily basis. This book is set in a slaughterhouse in Brazil, and our protagonist is a strange, curious man. He is a very, very religious person who has a very strict moral compass that has been inspired by his religious upbringing and his readings of the Bible, and he's taken a very clear stance on what he thinks is right and wrong. He's in charge of delivering the killing blow to the cattle in the slaughterhouse. And when he does so, he says a prayer, and he justifies his actions through his religion. And one day, someone else takes his place, takes his role, at least for a little while. And he doesn't like how this person is doing the job. He believes they're doing it wrong by his moral standards. And so he kills that person. This is kind of a reverse thriller, a reverse murder mystery where our protagonist is the killer. I read this book on a train. I was traveling from London up to York to spend a weekend there. I read this on the train journey up, and I felt emotionally drained and exhausted by the end. So just bear that in mind. This book kind of sucks on your soul. It's not an easy read, but again, another very rewarding one. This is Hit Parade of Tears, a short story collection by a legendary Japanese author, Izumi Suzuki, who sadly is no longer with us. She took her own life decades ago while she was still in her 30s, and she left us with a huge selection of revelatory stories. Most of her stories in some way are political, feminist, and often blur genre lines. She uses aspects of fairy tales, science fiction, fantasy to tell her stories. Sometimes they are dystopian, sometimes they are aggressive, sometimes they're funny. They really stretch across multiple spectrums when it comes to tone, theme, politics, and genre. This is a collection of hers. We've had a few at this point, all published by Verso. A few years ago there was Terminal Boredom, and now we have Hit Parade of Tears. This collection was actually translated by 4 different translators who all worked on different stories. There is David Boyd, Sam Bett, Daniel Joseph, and Helen O'Horan. All 4 of these Japanese to English translators worked on this collection and brought us some of the most punk, extreme, angry, aggressive, feminist tales ever to come out of Japan. Izumi Suzuki was a very, very curious figure, and if you like the idea of strange, punk, experimental literary stories that blend genres in lots of weird and wonderful ways, definitely check this out. This is a very curious one, also one that I only just read at the time of recording this video. This is an Indonesian novel, but it's presented kind of like 4 short stories. It was written by Diaz Novita Wuri, and she actually translated it as well from Indonesian into English, and that is not common. You don't often see a writer translate their own work, and whenever you do see it, it does take you by surprise. It's not the industry standard, and I think it's really cool that she did that. So like I said, Birth Canal is an Indonesian novel that tells the story of multiple different women across the 20th and 21st centuries. It discusses Dutch colonial rule, the effects of World War II, especially from the Japanese military, and the state of Jakarta today. The first story is told from the perspective of an unnamed man who has spent his life having a friendship with this girl, but he was also in unrequited love with her. They were never to be for various reasons, and one day she just disappears. And he's telling the story of their life, their friendship. She ended up dating someone else, he ended up dating someone else, but he always loved her. And one day, she's gone. All of these stories are connected. All of the characters overlap. And in the second story, we have the mother of the girl from the first story, and she has traveled to Amsterdam from Jakarta. She's there to tell the story of her mother to an expert academic who studies Japanese World War II history, because her mother was taken by the Japanese military to be a comfort woman. Comfort woman was the deceptive name given by the Japanese military for women taken from places like South Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia to work as sex slaves for the Japanese military. Her mother was one of those women. She was given the name Hana, which is Japanese for flower, and she suffered there, and her daughter is telling her story. The third story is about Hana, specifically about her husband, who is a Japanese soldier who has suffered extreme PTSD from war and takes it out on her. And then the fourth story takes us back to the present day. The girlfriend of the unnamed narrator from the first story is now living in Osaka with her husband. The two of them want to have a kid. She's trying to settle in, learn Japanese, understand the local culture, make some friends, and she becomes kind of obsessed with this Japanese woman that she always sees on her walks around the neighborhood. This is a book about generations, about the treatment of women by men, by society. It's about mothers and daughters, it's about marriage, it's about a lot of things. And it teaches you a lot about what Indonesia has gone through at the hands of the Dutch, the Japanese, at the hands of colonialism, of war. It's fantastic. Although I will say the first story breaks a lot of conventions and rules when it comes to storytelling, and I really, really didn't like that. That's my one gripe with this book, but it's powerful nonetheless. This is one of my favorite books of 2023, full stop. A Little Luck by legendary Argentinian author Claudia Pinheiro. This was translated from the Spanish into English by Francis Riddle, published by Charco Press, and it is an absolute masterpiece of literary fiction. This is another heartbreaking book. I don't think I've mentioned a happy book so far, and I don't think that's going to really change. A Little Luck hides a lot from you at the beginning, and it teases where it's going to go. I'm not going to spoil anything here. This is the story of a woman from Argentina who has spent 20 years of her adult life living in Boston, Massachusetts. When she arrived there, she married an American man who has recently died, and her work has sent her back to Buenos Aires, where she's originally from, and she's terrified. She really, really doesn't want to go, but she has to. She swallows all of her fear, all of her feelings, and she gets on a plane and she goes. But we don't know why she's afraid. We don't know what happened in Buenos Aires 20 years ago to scare her off to the US. And of course, we eventually find out. For some reason, she has never gone back to her home. She's taken a different name, and through flashbacks, through confessions, we learn what happened to her 20 years ago. This is a beautiful, beautiful book. It'll make you cry. It made me cry twice, once at the halfway point and once again at the end. It's about revelations, it's about honesty, and it has a lot to do with duty and what we think our duty to our families and to ourselves is. This is absolutely amazing. Of all the books that I'm talking about here, this is my favourite. A Little Luck is an absolute masterpiece of literary fiction. Here we have The Spectres of Algeria. This is a very strange Korean novel. It was written by Hwang Yo-jong and translated from Korean into English by Ye Won-jong. As I said, this is a weird book. It's told across 3 acts about different generations of people who are all in some way involved in theatre and in Marxism. The book reveals that Karl Marx actually wrote a play that was called The Spectres of Algeria. That play was put on at one point by a group of renegade, radical actors who were putting on plays during South Korea's military dictatorship, which ended in 1985. And they were putting on plays that were considered radical, plays that they were taking a risk by putting on. That story is told from the child of a member of that theatre group. And then later in the book, we are thrown into the present day with a young member of a modern day theatre group in newly free and liberated South Korea, who's trying to track down the members of that group and understand what this play was, The Spectres of Algeria, where it came from, and the fact that this guy found a used copy in a bookshop in Paris and translated it into Korean and put it on, and it's all very interesting, very strange. It's about the power of theatre. It's about how art and politics are forever intertwined. It's a Korean novel like nothing you've ever read. I don't have my copy to hand, but another great Japanese book that I read this year, that was published this year, is Mild Vertigo by Miyako Kanai. This was translated from Japanese into English by Polly Barton, and it tells the story of a regular Japanese housewife. This is a very, very short piece of literary fiction that explores the mind, the thoughts, the experiences, the everyday life of a bored and unfulfilled housewife. She's nosy, she's a gossip, she has her very, very strict routines, she has 2 sons that she has raised, she has a husband who exists and goes off to work, and we're just in her head. We're looking at how people contain multitudes, that no matter the life, no matter the situation, the mind is interesting. A person's experiences are interesting. We all have stories to tell. And it's also about how we can live very unfulfilled lives, but depending on the viewer and the reader of that life, it can be interesting nonetheless. Mild Vertigo is a very curious book. You can go check out my full review if you like, but I will say that it's intensely heavy for its length. There's so much density to it. It really requires a lot of focus, but it's very, very rewarding when you really dig into it. If you've ever read Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellman, this is a tiny little version of that. A book with run-on sentences, a book that's like a stream of consciousness that digs into the life, the inner workings, the machinations, the experiences, the conversations, the habits and rituals of a middle-class, comfortable Tokyo housewife. If that sounds interesting, check it out. Idol Burning is another fantastic Japanese book by Rin Usami. This was translated into English by Asa Yoneda, and it's about idol culture. This is also a very short novel, and it's told from the perspective of a high school girl who is absolutely obsessed with her one particular idol, a boy from a made-up idol group. Now, the author of this book is part of idol stan culture, and she wanted to kind of examine it and explore it from the inside looking out. When the book begins, our obsessive fan's idol has punched one of his fans, a girl, and he's receiving a lot of backlash for that. There's shockwaves rippling through the entire fandom. And this is her experience with dealing with that, with blogging about it, with going on social media and talking to her friends about it. She's dedicated to him. She has spent a long time making his life, his art, his experiences, her personality. And this is true for so many people who are in idol stan culture. Their bias, I think it's called, becomes part of who they are, part of what defines them. And this is a book that explores that, the effects of idol culture and what it means for the people who are in it. It's a very, very satisfying book to read, especially for me as someone who is not in this culture at all. Very, very curious. Unlike anything else I've read. Another Japanese book that I absolutely loved and is one of my favorites of this year so far is Honeybees and Distant Thunder by Riku Onda. This was translated from Japanese into English by Philip Gabriel, and it tells the story of a music competition, specifically classical music, specifically classical piano. We have 3 protagonists, and they are all young, experienced, competitive pianists, and they're all very different people, and we spend this novel getting to know their lives, getting to know their relationship to their art, and watching the competition unfold. The contest is happening in a small town outside of Tokyo, but it is an international competition, and we actually get to know the lives of the judges, a few of the other competitors, but there are 3 main characters that we're following. We see their relationships with each other blossom, we learn about whether they knew each other before and what they understand about each other, and how they're going to approach the competition, and whether or not they even want to be there, and what this competition means to them, their past, their present, their potential future. There's a lot going on here. This is a dedication, a love letter to classical music and its power and what it gives the people who play it, who write it, who study it, who perform it, who compete to do it best. This is a beautiful, beautiful novel. It's quite heavy, it's quite thick, but it mostly takes place over the course of a 3 or 4 day long competition. And we get to know these people and their lives, and they're all very, very different from very different walks of life. I loved this book. Absolutely loved it to pieces. And finally, we have another Korean novel, Greek Lessons by Han Kang. Han Kang is a legend of Korean literature. She is one of the big names of modern Korean literature. Her books are special. They are beloved, and for good reason, especially The Vegetarian, which won the Booker International Prize in 2017, I think, which was translated by Deborah Smith, who is also the founder of Tilted Axis Press. Everything that Han Kang writes is incredible. Human Acts, The White Book, and now Greek Lessons, which was also translated by Deborah Smith alongside Emily Ye Won. This is a dual narrative about a woman who is studying ancient Greek and the man who is teaching the Greek class. Slowly, as the book goes on, the two become closer, but primarily this is a novel about their 2 lives, and it is absolutely beautiful. The woman is an experienced writer, but she also suffers with selective mutism. She's divorced, and for some reason she's lost the custody battle of her child. And the teacher is kind of a mixed culture person who grew up in Germany and has struggled to find his identity and understand his self. This is a subtle book. It's kind of quiet. You intimately get to know the feelings, the experiences, the relationships, the pasts, the struggles of these 2 people who are very, very different, but each deserve your time, your respect, and I guess your love. I found this very remarkable, very, very different from all of Han Kang's other works. Her books are quite radical. They can shock and frighten you. They can be graphic and experimental. They can leave you feeling kind of gross, and there's nothing like that in here. Greek Lessons is pretty. It's very soulful. It's very, very much about people's hearts. And I found it beautiful. There you go. 10 fantastic books that were all published this year, written by women in translation. All female authors from around the world, all translated into English by incredible translators. If any of these have interested you, check them out. If not, just go find and read some wonderful women in translation during August. Celebrate WIT Month, celebrate great women authors, celebrate world literature, and do all of that at once. And of course, subscribe for books.